You know what really annoys me? It's people running around the world pretending to be experts on things they have absolutely no clue about, and people listen to them, and because they have no clue about it, they think these people who run about pretending to be experts have a clue about it. It's stupid and annoying. And one of these people is this guy called John Vervaeke. So who's John Vervaeke? John Vervaeke is a professor at the University of Toronto. He teaches at the Department of Psychology. And in 2019, Vervaeke published a 50-hour YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And that has made Vervaeke something of an internet celebrity and a public intellectual. And a lot of people think it's really one of the smartest things they have ever listened to. And that Vervaeke is absolutely brilliant, knows a lot of stuff. And that so annoys me because a lot of the things he says, they're completely wrong. They're just totally wrong, especially when he talks about human history. And the problem is he makes these claims when he talks to other YouTubers. He teaches them to his students at universities. And in his recent book that he published, that's also called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, he repeats these claims. So what I want to do in this video is focus on one of these claims that he makes about human prehistory and show how he is wrong, how much of a mistake it really is, and why it really shouldn't be something he gets wrong, but he totally does. In his video, he doesn't really spend a lot of time on this particular claim, but it is very important because it is foundational to much of what he has to say about the meaning crisis. So it's not just some little thing, it's a really big thing, and I cannot overstate how important it is to his entire argument. And because it is so important, I want to spend some time explaining the context of his claim, where his ideas for his claim come from, and how we know that they are wrong. So, what is this thing that annoys me that John Vervaeke says, and that is completely off the wall? I will just let him tell it himself in his own voice from his own video, and then I'm gonna break it down in detail so you understand what exactly is wrong and why it is annoying.
We know that we went through a near extinction event. Human beings almost went extinct. We were crunched down to a maximum of 10,000 individuals. Part of it seems to have been the overall climactic change of the end of the last ice age in Africa. Part of it, there's a super volcano that goes off around 70,000 years ago.
So what he is saying is that before the so-called Upper Paleolithic Transition, which he dates to have taken place about 40,000 years ago, that before this transition there was some kind of big catastrophe that wiped out almost all the human species to the point that there were like 10,000 people left. And one of the reasons he thinks this happened is because of a volcanic eruption. Now, this is not his original idea. It is actually something known as the Toba hypothesis. And it was a big thing back in the 1990s. This idea turned out to be completely wrong, but I think it was a really interesting idea. And there's a really interesting history to it that has a lot to do with how science works. And you need to understand it so that you know why it is so weird that Vervaeke gets this wrong. So the first thing I have to do is talk about how evolution works. And Vervaeke talks a lot about evolution, and he almost always gets it completely wrong. So what is evolution? There's a very technical definition for it, and that goes something like this. Evolution is the change of allele frequencies in a population over generations.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
An allele is basically what we call the different variants of a particular gene. Different alleles of the same gene do more or less the same thing, but in a slightly different way. If there was just one gene that determined our hair color, then it would come in different alleles for each hair color. There would be a blonde allele, a brown allele, a red allele. So whenever there's a gene and the gene mutates, the mutation of the gene is a new allele for that gene. Some changes can be very successful, so they spread through a population, others not so much, and sometimes some alleles disappear, and that's an ongoing process. And so when you look at the genome, the entire genetic code of an entire population, you can tell a lot of things about the genetic history of this population. And scientists do this by looking at the allele frequency. That is, how many different alleles are there in a population, and how common are these different alleles. And there are ways to know what kind of alleles should be pretty common and what kind should be pretty rare. And this gets us back to what Vervaeke is talking about, because here's what happened back in the 1970s. Some researchers were looking at a particular gene in humans, and there was something wrong with the allele frequency. The number and types of alleles did not make sense unless something really dramatic happened to humans in the past. They thought that the only way this kind of weird allele frequency distribution could have happened if a lot of humans had been killed sometime in the past 1 million years or so. The name for an event that really screws up allele frequencies in biology is a bottleneck event. And it's called a bottleneck event because on one side of the bottleneck, you have a big population, then something happens, that's a bottleneck, and now you have a much smaller population on the other side. And most bottleneck events are pretty chaotic, so not all alleles are affected equally. The rate by which some genes survive a bottleneck event has almost nothing to do with how well they survive under normal circumstances. A bottleneck event just really messes things up in a big way. And it wasn't just that one gene, but this kind of weird allele frequency distribution showed up in all kinds of different genes. And scientists noticed something else. They noticed that the further away a population lived from Africa, the more weird the allele frequency distributions were. So African populations were the most normal, and populations far away from Africa were the least normal. So there must have been more than one bottleneck event, but nobody had a clue what they were and when they had taken place. And this is what us gets to the second part of Vervaeke's claim, the volcano. So in the 1940s, there was this Dutch geologist, a guy called Van Bemmelen, and this guy was doing research on a big lake in Sumatra. And Sumatra is an island in Indonesia, and in Indonesia there are a lot of volcanoes, and so Van Bemmelen thought that maybe this big lake had been created by a big volcanic eruption about 70,000 years ago. And so eventually, most geologists agreed that Van Bemmelen had been right. And this lake, which is called Lake Toba, had in fact been created by a volcanic eruption. And this eruption turned out to have been the biggest eruption of the past 1 million years or so. Our best estimates have it at almost 3,000 cubic kilometers, which is absolutely insane. That's like a cube with a side length of 14 kilometers. Imagine a mountain twice the size of Mount Fuji, totally pulverized in a few seconds and thrown into the atmosphere. That was the Toba eruption. What eventually connected these dots was another volcanic explosion, and this one happened in 1991 in the Philippines, when a volcano by the name of Pinatubo blew up and messed up the global climate for a few years. Compared to the old Toba explosion, Pinatubo was a midget. The total amount of stuff that blew into the atmosphere was only about 5 to 8 cubic kilometers, absolutely nothing compared to Toba. But it was still big enough to make the world cool down a little bit, about half a degree centigrade on average, and in some regions as much as 2 degrees. But it didn't last long, and by the late 1990s, everything was back to normal. Pinatubo reminded everybody that volcanoes could really mess things up on a global scale, not just locally. And that is how the connection was made with Toba. There was an anthropologist at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a guy by the name of Stanley Ambrose, who had the brilliant idea that if a volcano like Pinatubo could cause quite a bit of damage to the climate today, maybe a much bigger volcano had caused much bigger damage in the past, and that may have been the reason there was this weird bottleneck in the genetic data. And Ambrose estimated that based on the size of the Toba explosion, it could have caused almost 1,000 years of global winter. And that would have been more than enough to wipe out pretty much all of humanity everywhere, except maybe in some really warm places in tropical Africa. So that, in a nutshell, is the Toba hypothesis. And as far as big ideas go, it was really neat. And it had perfect timing, because just in 1980, there had been the Mount St. Helens eruption in the United States, which had been the biggest volcanic eruption in the United States in pretty much all its history.
At 8:32 a.m. on May 18th, 1980, Such is the force of Mount St. Helens lateral eruption that an incredible 1,300 feet of mountain disappears almost instantly. Now the eruption enters its next phase. Expanding magma inside the volcano sends thousands of tons of scorching rock and gas high into the atmosphere. A dense plume of ash stretches 15 miles high.
And so by the 1990s, Hollywood was putting out a bunch of movies about volcanic eruptions and other natural catastrophes. And here comes this anthropologist and discovers that a volcano almost killed all humans 70,000 years ago or so. And it's also around this time that Vervaeke started university. And so the Toba hypothesis is definitely something he must have heard about a lot. I mean, I was only a kid back then and I heard about it a lot. But here's the problem. There's a reason it's called the Toba hypothesis and not the Toba theory, because all Ambrose had was a hypothesis. And in science, a hypothesis is basically one level above a hunch, but still a few levels down from theory. In science, a hypothesis is a starting point. It's when you have a good reason to believe something may have happened or something may be happening in a certain way, but not enough reason to say it really did happen or does happen this way. In science, a theory is when we are pretty sure that we know all there is to know about something. A theory is the best possible explanation for something, not just a hunch. So for the Toba hypothesis to become a proper theory, something we can say really did happen, we needed more data.
More input.
But there's one thing we did not find. We did not find evidence that humanity had been almost wiped out. From what we could tell based on the archaeological data, things did get rough for a bit, but not rough enough. Humanity seems to have been fine by and large. There was no evidence humans had disappeared anywhere, at least not for very long. And there was also no evidence any animals or plants had died out. And if humans had died out, then a lot of animals and plants would have definitely died out. Because humans are pretty good at surviving. They can eat almost anything and they can live almost anywhere and they are pretty mobile. But most animals cannot do that, and plants definitely cannot do that. Also, back then humans did not do agriculture. If something like Toba happened today, we'd be definitely screwed. We'd be running out of food within a year or two at most. And then we'd really have a bottleneck event. Most people really would not make it. But when you do not depend on farming for survival, then climate change really is not that big of a deal. It's no fun, but you will be able to survive a few years of winter. Maybe not 1,000, but a decade or so, definitely. And based on the data we have about animals and plants, the worst effects of Toba cannot have lasted more than a couple of years. So by the early 2000s, the data was in, and it obviously must have sucked really bad to have lived anywhere on Earth after Toba blew up, but it was not bad enough to cause a global bottleneck. And that's why I find it weird that Vervaeke even mentions volcanic eruptions as the cause of a global bottleneck for humans. I mean, he made that video in 2019, and it's now 2024, and even I know it didn't happen, and I don't talk about this for a living. To even suggest in 2019 that a volcanic eruption could have caused this bottleneck is very, very sloppy scholarship at best. At best, because it gets even worse, much worse. Because it turns out there hasn't been a bottleneck event in all of human history for at least 250,000 years. The last bottleneck event in our evolutionary history took place before modern humans even existed. The kinds of humans we are, that's what scientists call anatomically modern humans, have been around for only about 200,000 years, and we have never had a bottleneck event. So what about the evidence for the multiple bottlenecks? Well, we got it all wrong. Those weren't bottlenecks. What we were looking at for the most part was evidence for something different. What we were looking at was evidence for something called founder effects. Now, if you are a geneticist, they basically look the same because a bottleneck event and a founder effect have something important in common. Both are evident that at some point there was a much smaller population than there had been before. The difference is why there was such a smaller population. In the case of a bottleneck, the smaller population is a bunch of survivors. In the case of a founder effect, the smaller population is basically a bunch of colonists. In the case of a founder effect, the smaller population had left the bigger group and set up camp elsewhere. And after leaving, they didn't have much interaction with the bigger group they had come from. Genetically, that looks basically the same. The only way to avoid this effect would be to make sure that the smaller group has exactly the same genetic profile as the bigger group, and that's practically impossible. If anything, the people who move away are quite likely very similar to each other and on average more different from the people who stay behind. And that's exactly what happened. It's called the out of Africa theory. As far as we know, humanity originated in Africa, and about 70,000 years ago, some humans left Africa and ended up settling the world. And the number of humans who left Africa was quite small, because the only reason they left was because they found Africa too crowded and wanted to go somewhere else with fewer people. At least that's why I would have left. And then they just kept going. They settled in one area, and then that got crowded, and then some moved away to other areas, and then that got crowded, and on and on and on it went. And that's why we find a lot of those founder effects in the human genome, especially when you look at populations outside of Africa. And the further away from Africa you go, the more of these effects you'll find. And that is also why Africa has the most genetic diversity of all places on Earth. They have about 90% of all genetic variation. Places like Tasmania, Polynesia, or South America before colonization, they have the smallest gene pools, and their allele profile is way out of whack when compared to populations in Africa or near Africa, notable exception Madagascar, but I'm not going to talk about Madagascar. Founder effects aren't just something from ancient history. We can find evidence for them that go back only a few centuries, especially on islands, like Madagascar. So to get back to Vervaeke, this is not something he should have gotten wrong. And what I've been talking about in this video isn't even all that complicated. In fact, it's pretty easy topic to figure out. There's absolutely no excuse to go around in 2019 or publish a book in 2024 based on an argument that has been proven wrong for almost 2 decades now. There was no massive bottleneck event at any time in the past 100,000 or 200,000 years ago. It's absolutely and total
Bullshit. More and more bullshit.
The problem with Vervaeke is that he absolutely needs this bottleneck theory to be true, because his entire argument about the meaning crisis depends on it. Without this bottleneck story, almost everything he says falls apart. And why it falls apart is something I will be discussing in more detail in a future video. I'm going to be discussing the whole idea he has about the so-called Upper Paleolithic Transition, and I will be discussing and showing and proving why pretty much everything he says about it is totally wrong and is a total
bullshit.
So for now, this is the end of this video. All my sources are in the description box, and I really hope you follow up on them. And please, if you know anyone who is a fan of Vervaeke's, please share this video with them, because seriously, if all they know about early human history is from Vervaeke, they're in big trouble. Until next time.
Bye-bye. See you later.